you for joining us. I'm Ann McLaughlin. With me today is Deacon Maher from St. Jerome's Parish. We're happy to have him back again for a second time. And this time he's here in his capacity as a deacon and a scientist to discuss the church's position on stem cell research, which is kind of a complex issue, and we're glad to have you here to give us your expertise and your experience with the Vatican's insight in, or whatever.
Well, thank you, Ann. I'm glad to be here.
Okay. Would you give our listeners some idea of your background and how you came to be involved in this issue?
Sure. So I'm trained as a scientist in the biological sciences and have a doctorate degree. And so when I was ordained a deacon almost 2 years ago, I was assigned to St. Jerome's Parish in Weymouth, but also to the pro-life office in the Archdiocese of Boston. And as part of our mission is to teach about the Church's position about anything that deals with life, especially pro-life issues. So while most of the focus has been on abortion and last year on physician-assisted suicide, something that has been always in the media has been stem cells and the confusion about embryonic stem cells versus adult stem cells.
I agree. I think there is quite a bit of confusion, and unless you're following it, it can be just a lot of gobbledygook to a lot of people. So, but how long would you say stem cell research has been prominent or undertaken seriously?
Well, probably 50 years ago was the first use of stem cells, and that was with bone marrow transplants for treating lymphomas and leukemias and other cancers. And while the effect is due to the stem cells that are present in bone marrow or in blood, I don't think researchers knew that at the time. But it was in the mid-1990s when first embryonic stem cells were being isolated and used in research. And so the confusion has been between adult stem cells, which are any stem cell that comes after the embryo has developed versus embryonic stem cells, which are those that are in the first few days of life in the embryonic stage. And we have to remind everybody that we were all embryos at one point in our life. And the problem that the Church really has with embryonic stem cells is that it destroys an embryo. It destroys a life, not a potential life, but a life with life, potential. Right.
Yeah, a life with a unique DNA
That's
signature.
Right. Nobody else has ever been that person before.
True. Yeah, could you tell me, where do they get these embryonic stem cells to begin with? I mean,
well, most of the embryonic stem cells have been derived from in vitro fertilization techniques. For instance, in IVF, when they take eggs from the woman and mix those with the sperm from the man, they develop a number of embryos. And then those embryos will be implanted into the woman. There'll be many left over. And oftentimes those were ones that were being used for research, the human embryonic stem cells. In research, they've used rat and mouse and dog and many other species. But for the human, it really is oftentimes from those left over from IVF.
Do you know if the parents have to give permission for those to be?
Yeah, it's my understanding that they do have to give permission. However, in some countries, I don't believe that that is always followed. There have been a number of uses, inappropriate uses without permission of eggs and of embryos of individuals. And some of those have led to significant concern in the scientific community. For instance, one of the most recent scientific publications, which was from South Korea, indicated that there was a way of collecting embryonic stem cells. And as it turned out, this research was fabricated. And another concern was that the individual who did the research had collected those eggs from women without their permission as to what they were being used for. So there are abuses that take place. We try to control that, especially here in the United States, but I'm pretty sure that there are abuses.
Oh yeah, you can't be on top of everything. So we've talked about where stem cells come from, and you had mentioned that there's the embryonic and the adult. And So there are two types, and they're capable of different
Right.
uses or potential
Yeah,
uses.
they have different potential, you might say. So with the embryonic stem cells, which are collected during the first few days of the life of the child as an embryo, that's the only time that you can collect those. However, the adult stem cells, which, by the way, there's no moral issue using them, they can come from blood, they can come from bone marrow, as they have for 50 years in treating patients with cancer. They also can come from placenta, which is normally thrown away
Right.
after birth, cord blood, also from fat cells, from skin.
Fat cells?
Yeah, and so if you think about
That's amazing.
liposuction and all the fat that we collect, this is a way of collecting stem cells. They are adult stem cells, but there are so many of them, and they just typically are thrown away. Now, the difference is with regard to potential, is that with the embryonic stem cells, we say that they're totipotent, which means totally potent. They can be converted into any type of cell within the body. So that's the excitement, I think, that scientists have had regarding the embryonic stem cell lines.
Can I ask you though, is that
Sure.
an easy process or a painstaking process to turn them into anything?
Well, depending on where you inject them or put them, they can transform themselves. They seem to know in the environment that they're in what to be transformed to. So if you were to inject them into the brain, they would probably produce nerve cells. And if you injected them into heart, they would probably produce heart cells.
Oh.
But one of the problems with embryonic stem cells in general is that they're much more likely to overact, and
Yes,
so
and
tumors and
lead to
cancers
tumors.
are much more prevalent with embryonic stem cells in the studies that have been done in animals. With the adult stem cells, they are not totipotent, but they are pluripotent, which means that they can transform into some types of cells. However, one of the major breakthroughs that happened just a few years ago in stem cell research was done by an individual from Japan, Yamanaka. And Yamanaka and another colleague were able to induce these cells to go back to their embryonic-like potency. And by adding 4 different factors, they were able to take cells from skin or from bone marrow or from fat or from placenta and really revert them back to the stage that they were in as embryonic stem cells. And therefore, they could then be transformed into all different types of cells.
That's amazing because I just remember the basic structure of a cell, but you would think that a cell that is, say, blood tissue, then what kind of a process would it go back to become a less discerning cell, or less specific cell, I should say?
Well, many of the stem cells, when they are administered, for instance, in treating cancer, it's not that those cells themselves are turning into so much other cells, but they're releasing factors, growth factors, which then are positive for the environment of the diseased tissue that they're going to, oftentimes. So they're like factories that are releasing these growth factors and telling other cells to do
shut down.
to shut down or to do new and better things. Yeah, so it's like a little pharmacy in a cell that you're administering, and it's the right compounds that are really telling the surrounding cells. So it's supportive from that standpoint. They can divide, and they can continue to divide, and they can become these cells, but they do produce these growth factors that are beneficial in the treatment of a number of diseases.
Going back to the embryonic stem cells, the truly embryonic stem cells, and you were saying you can only use them up to a certain number of days. What do they do to put them in suspended animation? How do they stop them from becoming, more divided and
Well, early on, within the first few days when you collect them, you can then culture them and you can continue to have them to multiply. And then with the appropriate factors present, then you're able to have them differentiate into this type of cell or that type of cell. But typically what happens is when these embryonic stem cells are obtained, then they can be frozen.
Oh.
and then they can be stored for a long period of time, as can embryos themselves. Which, that's a whole other issue, is what
Oh,
do
I
they do
know.
with all these embryos that are frozen?
They
And really,
call
the church has not
I think they call
come
them
up.
snowflake babies.
Snowflake babies, yes, but there are so many that are stored that will probably never be allowed to grow.
Yeah.
And it's not appropriate
No.
for them to be implanted into women just to serve as surrogate mothers.
No.
The church, this is a complicated issue, and
It
the
sure
church
is.
really hasn't
Yeah, when I
come
was
out about it.
reading about it on the internet and thinking about it, it made me think back to a Robin Cook novel from, I don't know, it was the 70s or the 80s, Coma. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Where people were in suspended animation and they were harvesting their organs
Right.
for, it's just this same principle, I would say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's similar, yeah.
Sheesh. So I think we're getting into the ethical and moral issues regarding the, let's talk about that. So the Vatican's position is that these embryonic
Stem cells,
stem cells represent a potential person.
they represent a person with potential.
Okay, that's
Right, and not
better
a
than
potential person,
my
correct.
characterization. Yeah, a person with
So,
potential.
yeah, every embryo, which then would deliver the embryonic stem cells, every embryo, we believe, is a person. Life begins at the moment of conception. As soon as the egg and the sperm fuse together, that is a new entity that never ever has existed before. And we have taught, the church has taught, and I would suggest that if you were to ask any biological scientist, when does life, human life, begin? They would have to admit that it's at the moment of conception, because that embryo is not a dog and it's not a cat, it's a human. And it is alive. It respires and it has movement. It has everything in it that we think of as being alive. So I would argue that most scientists, if you really were to ask them that question, they would have to say that human life has to begin at conception. There's no cutoff point 4 days or 14 days later on.
Yeah.
It is at the moment of conception. So as a church, we believe that God-given life occurs at conception. Anything we do to destroy that or to prevent that in some way from developing is killing a human person.
I agree.
So the Vatican has really been strong about this. Many of the other Christian faiths also, but some of the others and various other religions don't go along with this.
Well, that gives us a lot to talk about in the second segment of the show. So please stay with us. We're going to really get into the meat of the matter. Hi, welcome back to Witnessing the Word. We were just discussing the Church's position on embryonic stem cell research and its moral ruling on embryonic stem cells as human beings, which you can't argue with there. So that gets us back to, is the Church opposed to all stem cell research? Or?
Oh, no, absolutely not. The church is very supportive of adult stem cell research and therapy. Because, as I may have indicated, with embryonic stem cells, there's not been one single person with a disease state has been cured or treated successfully with an embryonic stem cell. However, there have been thousands and thousands, hundred thousands of people who have been treated with adult stem cells, especially through bone marrow transplants, who, in fact, have been cured or successfully treated. The church, because they are so committed to this, has had 2 conferences at the Vatican to discuss adult stem cells and what we call regenerative medicine. So trying to regenerate diseased organs or tissues or systems within the body using adult stem cells. There's no moral objection to using adult stem cells because no life is destroyed in
Right.
obtaining the adult stem cells.
Uh-huh.
So the most recent meeting was just a few months ago, which I attended at the Vatican, and it was amazing some of the stories and the advances that they have made. And I think with the ability to take these adult stem cells from skin or from fat or from umbilical cord or placenta, and then to make them go back in time to more of an embryonic state, that was the most exciting portion of the conference. And hearing about stories where they have done this and have been able to, in small numbers still, to treat people with heart disease or with multiple sclerosis, some with diabetes even. There's been some progress with that. There was one truly amazing story about, and there have been now maybe 4 or 5 children who've been treated this way, where they're born with an abnormality in their trachea. Their trachea is their windpipe where they breathe. And they were born with a trachea that was much, much too small, like 1 millimeter in diameter, which allows for very poor
limited
respiration.
Yeah.
And what they were able to do is they were able to take a scaffold, which is sort of, you might think of it as
Like
chicken wire or
Okay.
something, and then using adult stem cells that had been induced back to more like an embryonic state, and had them coat this chicken wire, which was going to dissolve eventually. They implanted that into this child, one who was there at the conference, and amazing that
I've
it
read about
grows.
this. Yes,
yes.
it was
And it's happened now with a number of young children in particular. So
That's
this idea of
amazing.
scaffolding and allowing the stem cells to grow, and they seem to know what to do, has been absolutely wonderful.
And that research you were talking about, that might positively affect people who have laryngotomies and
Yes.
from smoking or whatever.
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
could
so
maybe
there's a
rebuild
lot
the
of
larynx
exciting
or whatever.
research that's being done. And that's why this conference, which was called Adult Stem Cells and Regenerative Medicine, is really regenerating diseased tissues and organs.
Oh, that's
So-
amazing. That's great. So the people at the conference, are they scientists or,
Well, it
or
was-
priests who are scientists?
It was a wonderful mix, and I felt privileged to be invited to attend as both a member of the clergy, as a deacon, but also as a scientist. And so I wore 2 hats there, and most of the people there were either clergy, and there were maybe 20% who were clergy, and the other were scientists or financial people, because the industry is interested in obviously supporting the development of successful treatments. There have been some companies which have been dedicated to embryonic stem cells, and they've decided to stop using embryonic stem cells because they realize
see
that
there's more potential
there's
in-
so much potential with the adult, and there's less of a barrier, obviously, from a moral or ethical standpoint. So one company, Geron, in California, stopped all of their embryonic stem cell research and trials, and have now just gone to using focusing on adult stem cells.
Now, so you told me about the success with bone marrow transplants and cardiovascular disease, and has there been? Are there any potential breakthroughs in Parkinson's disease? And you also mentioned multiple sclerosis.
Multiple sclerosis, yeah. At the conference, we met a person who had been treated. She had a young woman in her early 20s who had been treated with her own stem cells. They were collected from her, and then they were multiplied. There's a way to grow them, and you can get them to be released in greater amounts from the blood by using certain growth factors. And they treated this woman, and she was just completely changed. I mean, it took a couple of trials, a couple of treatments, but in this case, it was remarkable. Now, it's not that everybody who has multiple sclerosis is going to be able to do this and be successfully treated, but
True.
I think it's still very early in the therapy stage, and I think that with time, just as we do bone marrow transplants nowadays, starting 50 years ago, someday we'll be doing them for multiple sclerosis and for heart disease and for a number of other significant disorders.
Well, that's interesting. Now, why do you think that the media has really just kind of focused on stem cell research and the church's objection to stem cell research, and kind of pushed the adult stem cell research, which you say is
Right.
has more potential,
much more potential.
off to
Yeah.
the side.
Well, I think one of the problems with the media is that they don't have the time or the interest in necessarily differentiating between adult stem cells and embryonic stem cells. And I think for scientists, we understand the difference. And I think it's important that we educate people that not all stem cell research or therapy is going to be bad, because we mostly hear about embryonic and we hear about the church's objection. But we have to get the message out that adult stem cell research and therapy is something that the church actively supports, and there's absolutely no moral objection to it. I think also the media likes to have a little bit of controversy,
Oh, yeah.
and that's obviously is good for their business. A number of the researchers who are dependent upon federal funding or any kind of funding for their stem cell research, they have been really focused on embryonic stem cells, and I think their livelihood depends upon them talking up and making sure that they continue to get funding for embryonic stem cells. But I think that the future really lies within adult stem cells, and that all the hype that we've heard about embryonic stem cells is not going to lead to anything exciting.
Do you know if there are federal funds going to adult stem cell research also?
Yes, there is, but much of it is slow in coming, because I think that there was so much hype about embryonic stem cells. And now I think it's changing because we're finding the results, right, and the results speak for themselves.
Yeah. I know. I think that's one thing about Americans. They can have an ideology, but results really matter more.
They really do, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. We're kind of a product people, whatever. Maybe that's not the right word, but so you've already said that the church has always supported the adult stem cells. Will they always oppose the use of, you think they will always oppose the use of embryonic stem cells?
Well, if embryonic stem cells are obtained from embryos and it requires destruction of embryos, then yes.
But they wouldn't, like you said, they wouldn't have a problem with this process that the Japanese scientists...
Right, no, there's no problem with the induced pluripotent stem cells, the way of bringing them back in time to an earlier stage in their development. No, there's no problem with that at all. Yeah,
that's great. So it's quite a controversial issue, but so it seems like the main thrust should be getting the message out that there's more potential with the adult stem cells.
Right, but I think a lot of people would like to have all of the therapies being successful immediately. All those poor children who have type 1 diabetes, or people who have had Parkinson's disease. But it's going to be slow, but it's the proper way to do things, because there are nobody else has to lose their life in order for these therapies to be successful. And in reaching an end, the end will never justify the means. And if the means is destroying embryos, that's always going to be wrong and objectionable.
Yeah. Now, so the controversy hasn't been in the news lately, I would say, because there's so many other controversies in the news. But what do you see Catholic people's mission to be regarding this issue? Do you think we should, contact our representatives in Congress, or so that more money could go to adult stem cell research? Or?
Well, I think if you're inclined to contact your representatives and to tell them that yes, more should be for adult stem cell research and therapies, and absolutely that's a good thing to do. I think there are many other issues that people are writing their representatives about, and this is probably not on their radar screen. But I think it's important for us all to be educated and to know that embryonic stem cell research has never worked. It destroys a human being, and it is against our fifth commandment. Adult stem cells have been used for 50 years. There's much promise now that the Japanese Yamanaka has been able to show a way of bringing these cells back to a state where they can be converted into almost any type of cell. And so I think it's just a matter of time, and we'll start to see more and more about this, and the embryonic stem cell research is just going to go by the way, because it'll just be overwhelmed by the adult stem cells.
It's just that needs to get more publicity, let's say.
Right, and I think with more and more advances and more successful therapies with the adult stem cells, and that will hit the news. You read about that little girl with the trachea, and as there are more and more of these cases being publicized, then people are going to realize this. And then eventually the scientific community would probably realize that we're wasting our time with the embryonic stem cells.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask you. In the scientific community, you know, with scientists reading the publications and research and so forth, are they more aware, or do they need to be more aware of?
I think they're aware, and I
Okay.
think that there are some scientists who, because they've made their living on embryonic stem cells, in order to survive, they've continued to go that route. That company, for instance, they realize that to survive, they need to go in the direction that's going to be most successful. And they changed their course completely to adult stem cells, so they knew. And I think a number of the scientists, though, are just kind of hanging on and trying to ride it out. And
It's kind of a dead, you think it's a dead end?
I think it's a dead end, yeah.
Well, as you say, if, like with the little girl with the regrown trachea, and if things like that happen more frequently, or if there is some improvement using adult stem cells in diabetes, you know, you can't ignore success.
Right, the results will speak for themselves. That's right, absolutely. I mean, they've been able to grow ureters, which lead to the urinary bladder, and urethras and urinary bladders themselves in animals. And so I think at some point they'll be able to do this using adult stem cells in humans with the proper scaffolding and the proper techniques. It would be bioengineering tissue
Body parts.
replacement parts. Regenerative medicine is what it is. Yes.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. Well, I want to, I mean, you really opened my eyes to a lot that, you know, I'd read about it. It would just be kind of a blur. But this has really been very informative to know and exciting and hopeful to hear that it's something that's been there all along. And as you say, 50 years ago.
Right.
Wonderful. Well, God's always teaching us new things.
He sure is,
That's
yes.
great.
Absolutely, it's wonderful.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for coming on the show, Tim. It's been great to hear, to learn something new like this, and it's to know there's so much potential. And thank you for your commitment to the pro-life movement. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again. Take care.
Witnessing the Word is produced by the parish community of the Immaculate Conception in East Weymouth. We welcome new members to our parish. If you are no longer a practicing Catholic, please consider joining us some Sunday for Mass. If you are not currently active in a church and are interested in finding out more about the Catholic faith, join us some Sunday. Feel free to talk to our pastor or one of our permanent deacons. On behalf of our pastor, Father Bill Salmon, thank you for joining us in Witnessing the Word.